there was no king in Israel. And everyone did what was right in his own eyes. You see, on the surface, this does not sound too bad. And actually, if you read it this way, in those days there was no king in Israel, and everyone did what was right in his own eyes. It sounds pretty good. In fact, I want you to think about it for just a moment, okay? Our world would be an amazing place if everyone did what was right. Wouldn't it? Our world would be pretty amazing if everybody just did what was right. I think that man, we would have an amazing place. But they only did what was right in their own eyes. In other words, they only did what they thought was right. They only did what they thought was right. Now, this is hot off the press. And when I say hot off the press, I mean that I read this just this morning. All right, hot off the press. You ready? Proverbs chapter 12, verse 15 says, "The way of a fool is right in his own eyes, but a wise man listens to advice." Think about that. They did what was right in their own eyes, but the way of the fool is right in his own eyes. Proverbs chapter 14, verse 12 says, "There's a way that seems right to man, but it ends is the way to death." He says that again in chapter 16, verse 25. And so I think he means it when he says it twice within just a couple of chapters, right? And then Proverbs chapter 21, verse 2 says, "Every way of a man is right in his own eyes, but the Lord weighs his heart." So kind of get that into your perspective that everyone did what was right in his own eyes. But just because he thought it was right, just because it was right in his own eyes, doesn't mean that it was right. So let's take a closer look at the 4 times that it is said, "In those days there was no king in Israel, and everyone did what was right in his own eyes." Now, the first time was found in Judges chapter 17. It's verse 6, but I want to read verses 1 through 6 because something happens, and this is why the writer of Judges tells us everyone did what was right in his own eyes. So Judges chapter 17, verses 1 through 6, it says, "There was a man of the hill country of Ephraim, whose name was Micah. And he said to his mother, 'The 1,100 pieces of silver that were taken from you, about which you uttered a curse, and also spoke it in my ears, behold, the silver is with me. I took it.' And his mother said, 'Blessed be my son by the Lord.' And he restored the 1,100 pieces of silver to his mother. And his mother said, 'I dedicate the silver to the Lord from my hand for my son.'" Now, seems right for her. "I dedicate it to the Lord in order to make a carved image and a metal image. Now therefore I will restore it to you." So when he restored the money to his mother took the 200 pieces of silver and gave it to the silversmith, who made it into a carved image and a metal image, and it was in the house of Micah. And the man Micah had a shrine, and he made an ephod and household gods, and ordained one of his priests who became his priest, one of his sons who became his priest. And in those days there was no king in Israel, and everyone did what was right in his own eyes. You see, it seemed right for them to do, but when there was no king, all of a sudden we have idolatry. People make themselves a god in order to worship this God. That doesn't seem right though, does it? It appeared right to them at the time, and that's why they did it. Next we find it in Judges chapter 18. And this time it begins the story. And it's Judges 18, 1 through 31. And say, woohoo, I'm so glad Pastor's not going to read all 31 of those verses. I'm just going to read verses 27 through 31. But Judges chapter 18, verse 27 through 31. Because that first story unfolds into a next story. It says, "But the people of Dan took what Micah had made." Remember the image? and the priests who belonged to him. And they came to Laish, to a people quiet and unsuspecting, and struck them with the edge of the sword, and burned the city with fire. And there was no deliverer, because it was far from Sidon, and they had no dealings with anyone. It was in the valley that belonged to Beth Rehob. And they rebuilt the city and lived in it. And they named the city Dan, after the Dan, their ancestor, who was born to Israel. But the name of the city was Laish at the first. And the people of Dan set up the carved image for themselves. And Jonathan, the son of Gershom, son of Moses, and his sons were priests to the tribe of the Danites until the day of captivity of the land. And so they set up Micah's carved image that he had made, as long as the house of God was at Shiloh. And so if there's no king and everyone does what is right in their own eyes, and then people steal from other people, and they prey on the weak and the helpless and defenseless, and idolatry continues. The next time we hear it is Judges chapter 19. In Judges chapter 19 is verse 1 and 2, and then we'll also read verse 22 through 26 so you can get the idea. But in those days when there was no king in Israel, a certain Levite was sojourning in the remote parts of the hill country of Ephraim, who took to himself a concubine from Bethlehem in Judah. And his concubine was unfaithful to him. And she went away from him to her father's house at Bethlehem in Judah, and was there some 4 months. If you skip down to verse 22. And by the way, in that meantime, this guy goes back to Bethlehem and he gets his concubine. Verse 22, and says, as they were making their hearts merry, behold, the men of the city, worthless fellows, surrounded the house, beating on the door. And they said to the old man, the master of the house, bring out the man who came into your house, that we may know him. And the man, the master of the house, he went out to them and said, no, my brothers, do not act wickedly, since this man has come into my house. Do not do this vile thing. Now I want y'all to hear this verse right here, okay? Verse 24. Behold, here are my virgin daughters and his concubine. Let me bring them out now, violate them, and do with them what seems good to you. But against this man, do not do this outrageous thing. You see what he said to them? Do what you think is good. But the men would not listen to him. So the man seized his concubine and made her go out to them, and they knew her and abused her all night until the morning. And as the dawn began to break, they let her go. And as morning appeared, the woman came and fell down at the door of the man's house, where her master was, until it was light. You see, because there is no king, now we have sexual immorality. Because there was no king, we have abuse. Because there's no king, we even have death. All because there's no king in Israel. And everyone did what was right in their own eyes. The last one is found in Judges chapter 21. It's Judges 21 verse 25. It's the very last verse of the whole book of Judges. But the story is found in Judges 20 and 21. And in Judges 20 and 21, because there is no king in Israel, everyone did what was right in their own eyes, and there became a great division. And a civil war took place. One of the tribes of Israel was almost completely wiped out. That was the tribe of Benjamin. And we have a lot more death. Not just one person dies. A lot of death from both sides of the story. From both sides of the story. All because everyone did what was right. Everyone did what was right. You don't have to turn very far. It's the book of Ruth. I want you to read verses 1 through 5 with me. It says, in those days when the judges ruled. So we know that the days that the judges ruled is the days that there is no king. And everyone did what was right in their own eyes. In those days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land. And a man of Bethlehem in Judah went to sojourn in the country of Moab. He and his wife and his 2 sons, the name of the man was Elimelech. And the name of his wife, Naomi. And the name of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem in Judah, and they went into the country of Moab and remained there. But Elimelech, the husband of Naomi, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. They took Moabite wives. The name of the one was Orpah, the name of the other, Ruth. They lived there about 10 years, and both Mahlon and Chilion died, so that the woman was left without her 2 sons and her husband. And so now we see that there's more death. There's more death. Look at verse 19. So the 2 of them, meaning Naomi and Ruth, went on until they came to Bethlehem. And when they came to Bethlehem, the whole town was stirred because of them. And the woman said, "Is this Naomi?" And she said to them, "Do not call me Naomi. Call me Mara. For the Almighty has dealt very bitterly with me. I went away full, and the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi? When the Lord has testified against me, and the Almighty has brought calamity upon me." What happens when there is no king and everybody does what's right in their own eyes? Well, oftentimes bad things happen. Discouraging things happen. Terrible things happen. We've already saw that, well, there's idolatry. We already saw that people take from others things that don't belong to them. People are ruthless to those who are helpless and weak. People abuse others. There's death. There's division and war and bitterness, and there's even more death. And oftentimes when those things happen, we blame God. I went away full, and He struck me down. He's made myself bitter. But like I said last week, you reap what you sow. And everybody in the story has reaped what they sowed. Micah reaped what he sowed. The Danites reaped what they sowed. The Benjaminites from Gibeah, they reaped what they sowed. They all reaped what they sowed. But here's what's really going on in the story. This is the part we don't understand, but here's what's really going on. You see, in the Old Testament, God disciplines His children. And in the New Testament, God disciplines His children. Isn't that interesting? You see, in the Old Testament, God forgives. And in the New Testament, aren't you thankful that God forgives? You see, in the Old Testament, God heals. And in the New Testament, God heals. This is great stuff. In the Old Testament, God brings salvation. In the New Testament, God brings salvation. Because in the days that they did not have a king, the God of the Old Testament raised up a shepherd boy from Bethlehem to be king of His people Israel. And because our world needed a king, the God of the New Testament sent His only begotten Son, born of a virgin in the same town of Bethlehem, to be King of Kings and Lord of Lords. I have Ruth, if she would come play for us this morning. Because looking at our world, it is very clear that everyone is doing what is right in their own eyes. Everyone's doing what's right in their own eyes, and therefore, well, our world is full of idolatry. People making little gods that they could worship. Because everyone's doing what's right in their own eyes, our world is full of people who take that which doesn't belong to them. And they prey on the weak and the helpless, the defenseless. Our world is full of sexual immorality and death because everybody does what's right in their own eyes. There's bitter civil war across our whole world. The truth is there's a bitter civil war in our own country. And there's a whole lot of death. A whole lot of death. And the problem is that people blame God for all of these things. Where's God? Where's God when this coronavirus breaks out in China and is now spreading across the globe? Where's God when this happens? But we're just reaping what we sow. We're just reaping what we sow. But here's the good news, guys. Here's the good news. The God of the Old Testament, the God of the New Testament, is still God today. Here's my challenge to you. This morning, stop trying to do what you think is right. And surrender your heart to Jesus. Because if you don't have a king, you'll just do what you think is right. And that way will always lead to death. That way will always lead to destruction. It's only when we have a king and we submit to His authority in our life that we truly have life. And life everlasting. The song that she's going to play is Great is Thy Faithfulness. I want you to be thankful today that God never changes. We don't have to worry if God's happy one day and mad the next day, or if God forgives one day but doesn't forgive the next day, so you hope you end up on the right day. As He tells the children of Israel in the book of Malachi, He says, I, the Lord, don't change so that you're not consumed. He doesn't change so that we know that we can find grace, we can find forgiveness, we can find healing, because the God of the Old Testament is still God today. He's still God today. And He desires for us to make Him king of our life. It sounds good if everyone just did what was right. And you know what? We try our very best to do what's right. Unfortunately, our best just isn't good enough. And what is right, that isn't good either. We need God. We need Jesus Christ. We need a king. And He's the one that God has set up for us. Amen. Would you stand with me this morning?